And let me now hand over to Scott Moore, who will be chairing this session on sports and soft power. The title is Sports and Soft Power, Harnessing Icons to Shape Nations. We're going to dive into the powerful intersection of sports and influence, explore how nations and place brands can leverage the star power of sporting brands to drive commercial success, build cultural bridges, and transform global relationships, uncover actionable strategies to connect sports with the public, governments, and international audiences in impactful ways. Scott, over to you and your panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Moore. I'm a senior consultant at Brand Finance in our sports services team. And welcome to this panel discussion today where we'll talk about sport and soft power. Delighted to be moderating today's conversation where we'll hear expert opinions from a range of different sporting industries that explore the role of sport in driving a nation's soft power agenda. Before we jump into the discussion, I'd like a quick introduction into the relevance and scale of sport that we see at Brand Finance, and a few areas of which that we like to investigate. For governments, brands, and organizations, many of whom representatives are in the room today, sport is one of the most visible, unifying, and emotionally charged ways to shape international perceptions. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that carries influence far beyond the field of play into diplomacy, global branding, and economic development. There's also a language that's spoken across borders, a platform for national identity, and as we'll find out more today, a potentially powerful tool in a soft power strategy. So at Brand Finance, we conduct global studies to get an in-depth understanding of how sport influences key metrics across a variety of different stakeholder brands, including nations, corporate sponsors, and sporting organizations. Now, I'm sure many of you would have seen this slide pop up, but I haven't been afraid to put it up again today to talk about the extent of our research and what it adds value and gains for us at Brand Finance. So, pertinent to this workshop is that we can take this audience of over 170,000 respondents and segment them by their sporting interests to understand how perceptions and behaviors differ between groups and infer how they've been influenced by different soft power initiatives, whether that be hosting a sporting mega event or having a strong national team, and to really uncover where the truest and biggest impacts lie. With sports encompassing such a broad spectrum of activity, it's never been more important to understand how and where sport can deliver a return on objectives and how this ties back towards a soft power agenda. So say whether we're hosting a major sporting event, investment in elite national teams, or individuals, or infrastructure, or grassroots initiatives. It's important to have that right framework in place to measure and assess the impact of sport. So to set the scene, and a favorite slide of mine, is our global soft power research study reveals that sport is a leading interest and passion point amongst our global audience. It is obvious that sport is a topic that cannot be ignored. Globally, 48% of respondents to our research study are interested in sports, and only just behind that of culture, travel, and most recently, technology and innovation, which has overtaken. But it does, however, claim a wider audience than many other key soft power factors that we see, such as business, science, politics, and environmental affairs, indicative of its potential significance as a soft power tool. Therefore, comes as no surprise that sport is everywhere. And with over half the population in individual countries showing a strong interest. This graph just shows that at the minimum 32% sporting interest for nations all across the world that we research. Football remains the world's most popular sport, again, unsurprising to many, driven by this intense passion and engagement amongst audiences, and spearheaded by international club competition, continental championships, and also, of course, the Men's Women's World Cup. And we can see a lot of this interest is driven by African and South American nations, and also more recently in the Middle East. What is more that we see is that the emergence of a new wave of sports gaining massive traction in the form of esports and paddle and pickleball, the like. And esports in particular, which has now been sanctioned by the IOC to have its own Olympic esports series, the first of which will be held in Riyadh in 2027. And again, the Olympic Games, although arguably not an individual sport, but we research it to observe how the quadrennially held events, how much traction they get from sports fans globally, evoking the strong sense of national pride and kind of striving to unite nations behind their athletes. Now, while sport is a universal language, it does have many different dialects, with interest in particular sports varying widely between regions and countries. We see that in the US, American football leads the way, in markets such as India, cricket, and China, basketball. And one of my personal favorites, Australia, have a strong tennis fandom. Sport can build relationships between nations. And although it shares causation with other values and historic factors, playing the same sport is shown to have a strong correlation with familiarity and perceived influence of a nation. Breaking down how fans engage and behave, which varies by sport, is important in understanding the information that can feed into a sport and soft power strategy. And so who are our 2025 leaders in sport? As you can see, Brazil has claimed top spot again in this year's rankings. Although it is clear that sport has exposure to huge audiences around the world, it is not a direct driver of a nation's soft power, as this particular leader in sport attribute is not a driver of reputation or influence. However, the high exposure of sporting events and national teams competing on an international stage provide a platform for which other values and attributes can be showcased, such as sustainable cities or transport or culture and heritage attributes that we find a lot. Ultimately, soft power in sports is not just a success and celebration. It also raises complex questions. How can sport be a genuine tool for peace, societal and economic development, rather than just a branding exercise? What role do commercial sponsors, international organizations, and governing bodies play in shaping sport's global influence? How we can navigate challenges in ensuring that sport is a genuine tool for diplomacy and development, rather than just a showcase for national prestige. To explore these issues, I'd like to introduce our three panelists. Tim Ellerton is the Commercial Director at the British Olympic Association, which is the National Olympic Committee behind Team GB, and responsible for all revenue generation, which incorporates commercial partners, fundraising, and licensing. Professor Dr. Grant Jarvie is a professor with the University of Edinburgh and visiting professor at the University of Toronto, and founding director of the Academy of Sport, an international think tank serving the sports industry. He's also a member of the UK Soft Power Group and works closely with the Commonwealth Secretariat. Dr. Lin is a global expert in sport for development and peace, and currently serves as the advisor for sport and development and peace at the Commonwealth Secretariat. In this role, she provides technical assistance across the Commonwealth in driving policy innovation, integrating sport into sustainable development, youth empowerment, and social cohesion efforts. Please give them a warm welcome. Thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
To kick off proceedings, there was a rather timely announcement at the back end of last year that the UK was forming a dedicated soft power council. And almost to set the scene here, Grant, you authored a contribution to its strategic framework. But can you first tell us what is meant by sport as a soft power asset?
Thank you very much for these opening remarks, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope we can help in any way we can. But most of the sort of work that we do in relation to these two words there, soft power and sport, and both are potentially troublesome, particularly when you want to use sport as a soft power asset. Soft power, if you just go back to traditional definitions, most definitions still go back to Joseph Nye's ability to achieve a goal through attraction. How do you actually use sport to do that? And I think countries around the world are getting better at it. And I would like to make that argument today. Equally problematic, or just to put a marker down, is sport. When you look at a lot of particularly the British Council work on soft power, perceptions of countries, how other countries see us, the reports that come out will not mention sport very much. But what is mentioned there is international sporting events. So as a marker, can we just, for starters, have a broad definition of what this sport tool is? The United Nations have a very broad definition of it, which seems to be acceptable, and it includes play, it includes physical activity, it includes recreation, it includes indigenous sports, of which international sporting events are a huge part of this. So the sports definition, from what I want to say, is keeping that wide. I suppose a comment that I would add to that is that I tend to see sport as a toolbox. So we have this fantastic toolbox that is sport, with all these things in it: basketball, athletics, indigenous sports, you name it. But how do you use it to deliver both sporting and non-sporting outcomes? A lot of the work that we do is helping governments, helping local authorities, helping sports organisations develop a narrative and evidence about how you can use this fantastic toolbox to deliver both sporting outcomes, but also non-sporting outcomes. And sustainable development goals come to mind. So we have this fantastic toolbox, something that has incredible scale, incredible reach, incredible popularity. But how should we use it? I'm going to use one graphic example. Some people talk about sport. I mean, it is a fantastic network. Some people talk about sport as a network of networks. A past life for me, leading universities. But I remember wanting to secure a pretty good financial deal for University X. Couldn't get near person A or person Y or the organisation. Just wasn't happening. Step up, Sir Alec Ferguson. Known him for a while. Can you help us here? Do you know this person, X or Y? If we invited you to dinner, would you bring this person along to dinner? Of course, happy to help. So, network of networks, but that wasn't about sport. It was about securing non-sporting outcomes. And I think governments, I'll mention some of them later on, are getting a lot better at doing this. I don't think I'd go as far to say sport is leading this conversation, but I've heard that's been said more often, more recently than I've had over the last 5 or 10 years. So when we talk about sport and we talk about it as a soft power asset, just to finish off a couple of things, let's just take it for granted that I am pro-sport. There's lots of bad things, but I don't think we get the good news stories out enough. And if there are so many of them there, how do we help countries, organisations shape the story, shape the narrative with evidence, and get the good news stories out there? But why? So why does it matter? For me, or why does it matter as a soft power asset? Sport matters because it has scale, it has reach, it has popularity. So why would you not use it to carry messages? Sport matters because it is, as I've tried to explain, a real pillar of connectivity. Why would you not use it? Sport matters because it brings in large international crowds. I think Australia, the green and gold, branding the nation, they're just about to, they have been talking about already, the decade, the green and gold decade of major events, presenting Australia in that particular mode in terms of branding a nation. Sport matters because it's an enabler of cooperation and exchange, getting back to the network of networks. Yes, it's about trade. Yes, it's about business. Yes, it's about influence. But it's most definitely about cooperation, networking. And we'll talk about Australia, I'm sure, later on, but sport as a diplomatic tool. So for all these reasons, I think sport and soft power has become increasingly important. There are challenges, but it's all to play for.
That's a great kind of framework of understanding, I think, for the conversation today. So thank you. And I picked up a few of those buzzwords being toolbox or good news stories. And certainly in the UK, we have a toolbox of leading soft power, sport and soft power assets. And Team GB is known to be one of those leading assets, alongside universities or the English Premier League. But arguably most importantly for Team GB is that it's a key representative of the UK's nation brand in international competition. So Tim, I'd like to ask you, what is it about Team GB that makes it such a strong brand and also an attractive proposition for commercial partners or other partners that you work with?
Thank you for the question, Scott, to be here today and to meet you all. I think I'm very privileged to work in the world of Olympics and Team GB, and the reason I say that is I come from a football background before, and I'm one of the biggest football fans out there. I won't mention my fairly useless team from up the road. But it's quite polarising, whereas the Olympic world isn't. So when we're talking to big corporates who want to sponsor us and work with us, you're talking about 27 different summer sports, 7 or 8 different winter sports, pretty much equal split male and female, attracting all sorts of different minority groups across the spectrum. And that is ultimately what they're appealed by. It's, for everyone that loves Manchester United, that's not my team for the record. There's a lot more that don't like Manchester United. Whereas with Olympic sport, there is genuinely something for everyone. And I think the sort of human endeavour stories, and yes, they are, maybe the amateur world of Olympics is not quite as what it was today, and with good reason. But the human endeavour stories, the athlete stories that we try and showcase as best as possible are truly incredible and truly inspiring and very relatable. I always, when we're talking to prospective partners, I always make the comment that these athletes are in the same swimming pool as you and I are, or the same gym. They're probably swimming a few more lengths, and they're probably lifting heavier weights, but they're ultimately living and breathing in our communities and often doing 2 or 3 different jobs. So when you're talking to a commercial partner or a brand who interested in sponsoring, in our case, Team GB, that's pretty powerful. How you create that connection between your target audience, but also, the athletes and the brand values of Team GB. And one of my favourite stats, which is what makes people proud to be British, number 1 is our National Health Service, number 2 is Team GB, number 3 is our Armed Forces. I'm quite happy with that silver medal. There's something very wrong with our National Health Service if we ever top them, and if our armed services go higher, then chances are we're at war somewhere. So more than happy to take that second place, and that's something that people that we talk to are very inspired by, is that connection between what makes people proud to be British and the Olympic team.
It's great to hear about these interactions of these social elements, both domestically and internationally at kind of competitions such as the Olympics. And for me, having such a strong soft power asset as Team GB is the result of these interactions between socioeconomic and some political factors. But Lynn, I'd like to go to you. So what are the key areas of sport, as we know it, that can be targeted by some underlying sports policy agenda. And again, relevant to your expertise, how can sport be used as a tool for peace and development, including amongst the Commonwealth?
Thanks, Scott, and good afternoon, everybody. So I think I'd like to kind of prime your question by just giving a bit of an overview of what we do within the Commonwealth Secretariat, and specifically around sports and sports for development and peace. So the Commonwealth is, made up of 56 sovereign and independent Commonwealth countries. And in there we have 33 who are small island developing states, 33 of the world's 42. Primarily, we exist to serve these member countries, to support them to, in the area of sport, maximize the contribution of sport, quantify it really, towards sustainable development, towards these wider non-sporting outcomes that we speak of. On a day-to-day task, really, that looks like understanding that sports for the Commonwealth is important. It's a great convener. We have 2.7 billion citizens, 60% of whom are young people. However, it remains greatly underutilized. There are areas in which sports is appreciated, but there are areas, especially when it comes to government relations, where, yes, it is a great to have, but has not been fully invested in. And that's where we come in form of technical assistance, supporting a country to really pride itself in sport, be it national, elite, community impact in sport. That's what we do. And we found it to be very successful. We have some case studies there, which I'm happy to go into in terms of why this work exists. For example, in responding to these requests by member countries, work in active Mauritius, which is a small island developing state. In 2018, they approached the Secretariat, for example, to say, look, we've got a big problem of non-communicable disease, which is, as one would put it, as a wider concern that's in the periphery, a social policy concern within the country. And to tackle that, they said, can we get your support in investing in sport? Can you help us measure, to test and pilot whether sport can really help us to tackle this? So in 2018, we worked to develop Active Mauritius with the government. And we had different programs. There was one called Move It for young people between ages 5 and 11. There was Youth on the Move, with a substantive amount of investment in that, Aging World between 24 and 65, and also taking care of the elderly, so through an elderly fitness program. And reflecting from 2018 up until now there's over 400 sports facilities inactive in Mauritius, swimming programs, work that's ongoing at the grassroots level that is then feeding up into the elite level of sport. And NCDs has gone down. So they are now serving as a country that supports other member countries, other small island developing states, such as St. Kitts and Nevis, from the cross-learnings, what can be shared from a national level into that regional landscape. Yeah.
That's great. I think the Mauritius example is really kind of gives us a clearer picture of what certain countries with slightly fewer resources can do and how they can use sport as a tool to further their own development internally, but also looking abroad and looking at their more globalized soft power agenda. And Grant, I'd also like to get your views on this topic, and perhaps you have a few examples or case studies of nations that have successfully leveraged sport as a key pillar of their foreign policy. But also important for us today, what lessons can be learned?
Okay, a couple of examples I can give you. I think this is a two-way street. This is how we see other countries, but how other countries see us. This perception and reality is a two-way street. And countries have different ways in terms of presenting themselves, and some of these are thematic interests as well as geographical interests. Just before going to that, just to touch on what Lynn was saying there, in terms of sport, peace and development. Monaco has a reputation for A, B, C, D, E. But two areas of significant investment in terms of how the Principality wants to present itself is one about environmental and sustainability, but they put lots of funds into sport, peace and conflict resolution. And have been doing that for a long, long time. Am I understanding the way? So in that sense, you know, the Principality's soft power message is sport, peace, development is important to us. We want to be seen to be helping here. And my understanding of how that works is that the Principality will fund a project in country A, B, C, D, E, will bring the team together, will assess the need, listen, but ultimately put the resource in to help a program for, say, up to 5 years be sustainable. And whether that be boxing and crime reduction or drug rehabilitation or helping with child soldiers, the use of sport in rehabilitation of child soldiers, you know, a whole range of projects in some really challenging parts of the world. And then, you know, the showcasing of what's done. Come to Monaco at the end of the 5 years. We want to move on to another project. But by that time, the goal is this is sustainable. We can hand this over to government A, B, C, D, E, and you can help it going. So there has been lots of Didier Drogba is Vice President of Sport for Peace. I'll say a little bit more of him. So I just wanted to touch upon that in terms of sport, peace and conflict resolution. Perceptions of countries. I'm sure you wish it was Tottenham Hotspur, but you know, another company looking at aspects of icons as sports branding, the Premier League, the respondents that they asked, 87% of people felt better about Britain because of the Premier League. I'm going to use another example, one football example, then I'll move away from football. Tourism. Number of Germans visiting Edinburgh over the past 2 years has increased by 156% year on year over the last 2 years. Not because Scotland were successful in the European Championships, but because of our fantastic, well-behaved Tartan army of ambassadors and friends who, according to German tourism companies, brought warmth, kindness, humour to Germany. And that in itself escalated into upturns in terms of tourism, curiosity, growing interest in Scotland. So tourism, perception, international event. I make my point about international event. International events can have boosts, but you need event after event after event after event if you're just going to keep that going. But Norway. The Norwegian Minister of International Development has, this is from the 1970s, you know, this started, but the Norwegian Minister of International Development has long since argued that the Norway Cup, which brings the youth of the world to Norway every year, Youth Sports Festival, is one of the best soft power assets that Norway has. Sport helping to produce cooperation, internationalism, links between Norway and Brazil, Norway and Palestine, Norway and Kenya, you know. And what the Norwegian minister for international development wants to get out of that is that a simple reminder of country A, B, C, D, you all came to Norway. Could be Palestine, Israel, could be when the Troubles in Ireland were there, different religious orders, bring the youth of the world to Norway, huge sports festival, build something on top of that in terms of education, discussion about conflict resolution, and what the Minister for International Development said is that should that conflict, or should country A, B, C, D, E prosper or develop in a better way or have more peaceful relationships, then we hope that these youth remember that Norway helped that country on that journey. That's all it is. Perceptions, youth, Norway helped you along the road.
Thank you. I think
Just say one last.
Of course.
I haven't mentioned Wales yet. So Wales, Wales have done a huge piece of work recently in terms of global sporting ambassadors, and the significance of that is, yes, the work, yes, the ambassadors, but it's been, physically written into Wales's global international strategy 2025. So sport consciously, intentionally planned outcomes which sport can help deliver in relation to international relations.
Thank you. And it's becoming more clear through these examples of the strong role that sport can play in driving these international relations and social initiatives, with peace and development. But we also see there's quite a strong commercial incentive. Another area we'd like to investigate at Brand Finance is the role in sponsorship in driving perception and behavioural changes towards the brands that are involved. And again, perhaps relevant to our audience here, we've seen a host of tourism boards and nation brands sponsor leading properties across the world. But using commercial partnerships as a reference point, Tim, it'd be grateful if you can tell us how brands align themselves with national teams such as Team GB and capitalise on the soft power of sport. And perhaps you can share some examples of meaningful integrations that have been kind of successful over the years.
Yeah, I think, your first point about nation countries using sport as a sponsorship vehicle, I think, Premier League's a very good example of that because of the, there is a mass audience across the world. Mm-hmm. It's the eyeballs, and whether it's Visit Rwanda for Arsenal, and there's many other examples as well. We have slightly different perspective on it, that we're more likely to attract a sort of GB focused brand because that's the domain we can operate in. Any sort of residual effect that organisation has outside of the UK is purely a bonus, but we focus more on the UK. I think a good example is one of our main partners is Aldi, the supermarket company. They are, a German company. I think that's fairly well known. But they were very keen to portray two key objectives. First of all was to be seen to support Britain and to see, because 95% of all their produce, fresh produce, is made and produced by British and Irish farmers. And secondly, that every family in the country should have access to affordable fruit and veg, and they utilise their partnership with Team GB to deliver those messages. There's other residual benefits that come with it, but they were the two prime ones, and we just signed with them till 2032. They'll support us at the next two Olympic Games. So the key for me is some very clear objectives that are not only achievable, but we're realistic on expectation. Our banking partner, NatWest, said a slightly different approach. They employ 67,000 people in this country and ultimately want to use, yes, of course, there's a big brand play, particularly around the Olympic Games themselves, but actually inspiring and uniting their workforce is a particular point. So we do a lot of health and well-being with that organisation, trying to get people to sort of break down silos that any organisation, frankly, faces, getting different departments to work closer together in the same way that we do with 330 athletes across 26 different sports. So there's many different ways to skin a cat, as they say, but I think the clear objectives piece is probably the big driver in commercial success that certainly we've had.
And I think these renewed partnerships are very kind of indicative of the strong relationships that are being built here, but also kind of the different objectives that are being met, both from a kind of a brand building and commercial sense. But investment in sport, in a sports agenda, often can come as an opportunity cost, as we know, to other initiatives that we look at within our global soft power index, perhaps science, technology, or arts and culture. And Lynn, I think you briefly touched upon it earlier about this measurement framework, and I understand this is a key focus of yours in your work. I'd be interested on your take of how we can measure the impact of sport development, and perhaps using a different example earlier, how the countries can use sport to elevate their kind of global presence by investing in sport.
No, thanks. Thanks, Scott. I almost called him Tim. That's great.
It's probably
Great marketing there. No, really just to say that as the Secretariat, it's a move from development to implementation. It's clear that sport is one of our greatest assets. It's a convening power, but then the translation into the how, that's where a key part of our sports for development and peace work lies. And so, just to kind of give you a sense of how this work began and where it is and where it hopes to go. So back in 2018, during MINEPS 6, which is the International Conference for Ministers responsible for sport and physical activity, the Commonwealth Secretariat, together with UNESCO and other key global stakeholders, were mandated in Kazan to do the Kazan Action Plan. So there was 4 areas to focus on with the Kazan Action Plan. We primarily focused on Action Area 2, which was to develop a common set of indicators that would help measure the contribution of sports towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And from there, we put together everybody to kind of test, to kind of treat different data to understand, can sport truly support the measurement of the SDGs? From that, 147 odd indicators were developed, and but it wasn't enough to stop there, to come up with global, regional, and national, subnational indicators around sport. We decided we need to take this a step further. So in 2022, began work around the Global Sport and SDG Impact and Baseline report. This report has provided us with a snapshot of where, for the Commonwealth and for the globe, sports is contributing to the SDGs across 7 domains of impact. These domains mirror the Sustainable Development Goals, so around think health, education, gender, good governance of sport, work that you are really well doing, and more importantly, where do we stand? We've got 5 years left towards the SDGs being achieved, or where do we go beyond 2030? So from that second wave of developing this impact report and an interactive dashboard, the hope here is that these 56 member countries can go on this dashboard and say, where do I stand? Where do I rank when it comes to the measurement of sports to the SDGs? And we hope that that serves as a sort of wake-up call, but also a clarion call as to really invest in sport. And so that comes in with our 3rd wave for us. Yeah.
It ties in very nicely to our indexes and our rankings that we put out. And conscious we're about to run out of time, but I am going to insist on a kind of one very short takeaway from each of you on a couple of questions I have. So Tim, first of all, a quick line on emerging sports, and do you see this playing a bigger role for Team GB and globally?
Good question. As we've got the 1-minute version, is one thing that the Olympic movement has done exceptionally well, I think, is bring in new sports to engage a younger audience. So there is a myth that the younger, Gen Z, are not interested in Olympic sport. That is complete nonsense. They absolutely are. In fact, it over-indexes against all others. And part of that is their ability to refresh their repertoire of sports. We're going to see flag football, cricket's going to be in the next one. We've had breakdancing, you could argue with limited success from our Australian friend. But skateboarding, BMX, etc., in cool, edgy sports that thankfully I'm not into, but fortunately my kids are. So I think the world of Olympic sport is in very rude health because of that and the ability to engage new audiences, and who knows where we go with with esports, but that's definitely one for another time.
And very quickly, Grant, if you could phrase in a few words the major way that sport can be better leveraged. What's one takeaway that this audience can really can go home and think about as how they can leverage sport as a tool for soft power?
Well, I think it's the approach that you take. So I would look for mutual areas of cooperation where you can build good news stories and sustain long-term relationships. And sport has a good track record of enabling that to happen. Cooperation, networking.
Great. And just finally from you, Lynn, one takeaway for countries, organisations and brands where they can be more intentional in using sport in your opinion?
Great question. One key takeaway, partnerships. Do not undervalue the strength of intersectoral approaches. So if you're working within sport, make sure you're also working within health, education, and other connected spaces. That's what I would say.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your insights and opinions and comments today. That's been an extremely big learning curve for myself, but also hopefully for the audience as well. So thank you again for participating, and we hope you enjoyed, and we'll quickly get off stage.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.